Welcome to the TXBA Studio channel. In this first video, I'm going to talk about how I stumbled onto the secret for making backing tracks that don't disappear as soon as you start playing guitar along with them. This new channel, TXBA Studio, is something that I'm doing because not everybody's interested in the kind of behind-the-scenes stuff that goes into running a business like Texas Blues Alley, but nonetheless, I like to have an outlet for it, so that's what this channel is going to be. So several months ago, I set out with a goal to make myself some backing tracks that would be fun for me to play along with. At the very beginning, my first thought was, I'll just make sure that these tracks have a pretty strong bass guitar sound and a nice solid kick. So I use Superior Drummer for my drum parts, and I use either Easy Bass from TuneTrack or Moto Bass 2 from IK Multimedia. And I alternate between the two depending on the song. One sounds better than the other. But I fooled around with them for about, 3 or 4 days until I found a consistent sound that I liked that I was going to use for all my tracks. And I went ahead and put together some test tracks, and I mixed it down, and I mastered it at what I considered to be a reasonably good volume. I think it was minus 11 LUFS or something like that. I quickly discovered that just having a good bass and kick drum sound was not enough to overcome the challenges of hearing it while I was playing. So I went back to the drawing board, and my next idea was I'm going to create 2 versions of each track. I'll make one that's mastered kind of quiet with a lot of dynamic range left. That way people can record with it without being completely maxed out. And I'll make a different version that's for practice, and this one will be like compressed for radio. It's going to be super loud, a lot of compression. And so I did that, and that certainly helped. When I compared the normal to the loud version was easier to hear, but it still didn't overcome the challenges of me having a hard time hearing the bass and the kick drum while I was playing. Now, obviously, if you have a track that has keyboards or other things that carry the melody aside from the bass, this problem is a lot easier to solve. But in my situation, I'm practicing for a power trio, and I want to test my ability to fill that space with just my guitar and vocals if it's that kind of a song. Bass guitar and kick drum are extremely important because kick drum is how I hear the meter, and the bass guitar is how I hear the melody, the chord progression. At this point, I was a little lost, and I was thinking, how is it possible that even when I really push the dynamic range, when I squeeze the last bit of dynamic range out of this and really punch up the loudness, how is it that I'm still having a hard time hearing those specific parts of the mix while I'm playing? I don't remember where I was when I had this revelation, but it finally hit me that when it comes to practicing with a track, I need to think less like studio and think more like stage. We're trying to solve the exact same problem. I've played on a couple of stages that were outdoors at like a big amphitheater, and that's particularly challenging because you're spread out, and sound when you're outside and wind's blowing, it just kind of goes all over the place. So I thought back to what would I do when I was at those gigs and I needed to hear the bass. I would tell the front of house engineer to give me more bass in the monitor speakers. And what was coming from that monitor speaker was not nice, deep, bass that would sound good on a record. What came out of that monitor speaker was a top, mid, and high frequency, heavy, kind of nasal sound for the bass, but I could hear it. And that was the point. And the same was true for the kick drum. If I needed to hear more of the drums in my monitor, I would ask for more snare and I would ask for more kick. And when the kick came through the monitor speaker, again, it wasn't a nice solid thud because depending on the gig, that might just be a single 12-inch and a horn monitor speaker. What would come through was the smack. That smack that would come through is what would allow me to hear it over the sound of my own guitar and over the sound of my own vocals. And so all of a sudden, the revelation hit me. if you make a track that sounds good on its own, it's not going to be hearable while you're playing. After I realized that, I'm aiming for the wrong thing here. It can't just be two different tracks mixed at two separate levels, one loud and one soft. I have to let go of this idea that the practice tracks are actually going to sound good by themselves. They're going to sound silly. But what makes them sound silly is exactly what is going to make them hearable while I'm playing guitar. So the kick drum was actually pretty easy. I'm just going to loop over a section of the track here and I'll isolate the drums. So on the normal drums, if you look at the EQ curves here for the different drum mics, you'll notice that, and these are roughly based on how they were with the preset that I started with. You can see they're emphasizing low end or a little bit of low, mid-range, and then for the sub, they're emphasizing the real low end. So that is kind of where I started. What I ended up with for the loud kick drum, if you look at these plug-in curves, these EQ curves, the sub one is about the same, but the other two, this one has a pretty significant peak just under 5K, and the other one has a whole lot of basically leaving as much slap in there as possible. All right, so right now I'm listening to the kick in, and if I take this EQ curve and really punch it up, you can hear that it really comes through. I set it at a level where I could hear it good. But if I take this out, it just brings out a little bit of the high frequency slap there. But where you can really hear it is on the kick out mic here. Let me go ahead and solo that one. So this one here, if I take this high frequency boost out, okay, so I just went through each of the different mics, and what I really tried to do was figure out the frequencies that I needed to boost or to release to really allow that click to come through. Now with the bass, it was a little bit more challenging. I wasn't sure what I needed to do to the bass, to be quite honest. I tried a bunch of silly ideas, like I doubled the bass part up and I put an octave up, but then that just sounded very strange. I had what was a really decent, nice, warm bass sound that I was basing everything off of. And so I tried a couple of things, like going with multiple channels here and setting one of the channels, running amps in parallel, running one clean. In the end, what worked the best was a quick tweak to the amp settings and amplitude. Basically, I turned on the high. Let me go over here. That just allows a little bit more sparkle. And then I bumped up the mid and I turned up the frequency a little bit. Okay, now because of the changes I have in the EQ, it's not going to be as apparent. And then I also opened up the treble a little bit. So that was the first change, but then the real change came in the equalizer curve, where I just boosted the heck out of two different frequency ranges here. If I turn those off, now we're right back to a nice warm bass sound. And the way that I arrived at these two different places to boost and at their levels was I sat here and I played, and I just fiddled with this EQ curve until I could hear the bass while I was playing without having to make the track incredibly loud. So then after I got it set up here, I did a quick export and I went down and I tried it on the stage, and I even tried it on my phone. And the interesting thing is, when you listen to these tracks with a device like this, compared to the regular, you can hear the rest of the drums pretty good, but the kick and the bass drum sound are nowhere to be found in the regular track, whereas in the loud version here, it's these frequency bumps here, the first one at around 320 and the other one around 1300. These frequencies will vary depending on what bass model you're using. But the way I arrived at them was simply by experimenting, fooling around with the kick drum EQ, fooling around with the bass, the EQ on the bass channel here, until it just kind of popped through the mix. And it's important to evaluate it while you're playing the instrument that you're trying to kind of mix around. So I had my guitar playing the same way that I would have it if I were jamming anywhere else, and I was having to let go of the idea that what I was going to make was going to sound good, because, you know, when you put it together, you can't leave the solo on if you want it to sound good. When you put it together, it does sound a little bit comical. And so if you're used to producing things in order to sound nice, it feels weird to kind of purposely produce something that sounds bad. But any hesitation that I had disappeared as soon as I went to play along with it, because I realized it was far superior for that purpose. So then I just decided, well, I'll just send out 2 copies, and I'll tell people one will sound good and it's quiet and it's good for recording, but if you want to jam out, use the practice track. It's going to sound silly until you start playing along, and then all of a sudden it's going to sound better. So anyway, that's a behind the scenes look at how these backing tracks got to sound the way that they are, and thanks for watching.